Okay, thank you very much. I'd also, before I start, like to say that I'm sort of speaking to you today from the lands of the Wadamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, both past, present and emerging. And I also like to say that it's very exciting to be at a conference with a museology stream in it. Terrific to see. The last time I tried to use the word museology at Macquarie University was to introduce a unit of study, which we call the Museology of Natural History. And I remember when we did this, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic at the time said, you know, this all looks very good. Yes, we'll support you doing this. But that word, museology, it's not a real word, is it? So anyway, I had to explain that the museology is a word that possibly isn't used as frequently in the English-speaking world, but it is used in a lot of other places, and it relates to a whole sort of history of discourse around museum theory, processes of objectification, and the idea of musealization, which of course is another word that the DVC academic also hadn't heard of. So anyway, it's great to see it back on the conference program. Now, conferences like this, of course, are really terrific because what you'll get to hear about is lots of fabulous and interesting projects that people are doing, such as the last one we just had from Ibrahim. But at these conferences, there is always some old boring bastard who insists on talking about theory. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my role here this morning. Anyway, there's our title slide, and you can see there the people who put this together. We're all associated in different ways with some of the collections here at Macquarie University, and we all believe that collections in higher education, when used creatively, or in fact even when just used at all, can make a big difference to the business of the university. So Rhonda's the senior curator at the Macquarie University Art Gallery. Gina's the manager of the Psychology Test Library. I'm a casual at the Art Gallery, but also a volunteer at the new Macquarie University History Museum, which is an amalgam of the old former Museum of Ancient Cultures and the Australian History Museum. So let's just start with a few basic terms, and let's look at the term heritage. It's in the conference title, and it's also in the research group name that's hosting the conference. And as we know, there are different types of heritage, and it's applied to all sorts of different types of things. The critical point being it's a value judgment based on a process of selection, meaning that a thing with heritage value deserves some form of special attention. Usually that is an attempt at longevity or some sort of permanence or semi-permanent state it's to be kept in. It means it's not like a gorge that you blow up or a Bamyan Buddha that you blow up or something like that, if it's got this heritage value. Okay, so objects are of course the basic currency of museum theory, and the process of musealization, if you like, is the process that removes an object from its original context and puts it into a new context, the context of the museum. So it's the process of decontextualization and recontextualization. So on this slide here, I've tried to graphically represent it as the kind of, I guess you could call it the planetary model of the object. The object, there it is, sitting as something solid in the middle of this kind of metaphysical ocean of context. And it's that kind of materiality of the object versus the immateriality of the context that is essentially the binary that underlies museum theory, if you like. If you go into this really deeply, I did a bit of exploration in some of the literature and looked at some of the material culture theories, and there is actually something called thing theory. I'd never heard of thing theory until I started researching for this presentation. And thing theory, apparently, yes, it really is a thing. And not only is it a theory, there are also thick things and thin things. Thick things have extra layers of context, and thin things only have small layers of context. So anyway, that's very, very interesting indeed. But of course, it's the way that objects relate to people through materiality and context and value to give them meaning. And objects obviously must mean something to people if they are to have some form of heritage value. So I like to sort of, instead of using the planetary model, I like to use this model here, which I call Grape Theory. Now, Grape Theory is the only original part in this entire presentation today. So I like to think of objects really as being like the central stem of a bunch of grapes, and the actual grapes that hang off that stem are kind of like the data that forms bundles of context building things around that object. Okay, so it raises the question, of course, what happens when objects are altered? Do they simply change their context, or do they become something new? When the stem of the bunch of grapes changes, does how the bunch of grapes itself actually look, does that actually change as well? And of course, this is very important in terms of the digital turn, because what happens when we have the ability to endlessly replicate an object, what does this do to its heritage value? One of the basic questions that many people have been wrestling with for some time. And then furthermore, what about an object that is actually born digital? And here's an example of one here. And here, this is the recent work of the collaborative of ultra technologists from Japan who call themselves Team Lab, that is essentially redefining the museum experience through generative artwork. And generative artwork, of course, is work that changes depending on how people interact with it, just the same as a gaming platform or something like that. Can we still actually call this in its entirety an object? Is it an entity with a bounded surface between itself and its context? Or does the interactivity mean there is a quantum exchanges across the boundary of the object, if you like? Now, also pleased to let you know that the Macquarie University Art Gallery has the first Team Lab work that's ever been collected by a university art gallery, and this is very exciting, because we believe this is going to have great this is going to be a fantastic resource for teaching, particularly for teaching media and cultural studies, but also, of course, for teaching museum theory. But as well as this more recent acquisition, we also have some of the earliest born digital objects as artwork in the collection. And this is an example here from a show that was on some years ago at the university's art gallery. This is a work by the Australian holographic artist Paula Dawson. It's called Two Absent Friends. And what it does is it captures the scene in a bar on New Year's Eve, and it captures it at different stages. And the artwork works by having these large sheets of glass with lasers put through it, and it forms the sort of holographic image. It's a remarkable object. It has some of the deepest holographic depth of any single work or any single art object, I believe. And it captures the dimension of time as well, as this kind of artwork can do. So yeah, what does this actually, what does the heritage value of this, or what is the heritage value of any born digital object? Where does it actually lie? Now, if we say that the heritage value of an analog object, any normal sort of an object, if we say that that lies at the intersection of its materiality and its context, can we say that the heritage value of a digital object actually lies at the intersection of the data stream and the media substrate that brings that data stream to life? That would seem to many people to be the simplest way of applying the heritage theory of analog objects to the digital world. Does that sort of still make sense? Then, of course, raises further questions. By the way, in this slide here, we've got a picture of some early media substrates there, including the one on the left, which is one of the old punch cards from the Macquarie University punch card system from way back in the 1970s or whenever it was, with a picture of the university's library on it. So that's quite impressive. So, yeah, what happens when the media substrate changes over time? That gentleman holding the disc there, I'm told that that's a disc from the 1960s, and it holds about 5 megabytes worth of data. Very impressive way to store data there. And of course, the media substrates are changing all the time, but how does this actually change the heritage value of the actual artwork? Okay, so let's complicate things even more and look at what material culture theorists would actually call a syncretic object. And this is an object of place. And here, objects of place are certainly, or places are certainly considered to be objects. Heritage theory certainly does this, because the heritage value of a place undergoes exactly the same sort of analysis that an object would in a museum collection as a way of determining its significance or its value. So here's a couple of early images of Macquarie University, this place, and it's been through quite a few changes. And the changes that a place would go through could actually be what a museologist would call an object biography, if we're still keeping that analogy of place as object. And it's interesting when you think about the site of the university there, would have started off being Darug sandstone dreaming country, then with an overlay of agricultural colonial settlement, and then finally another overlay of an epistemic colonizers in the form of a higher education institution, bearing the name of a supposedly enlightened colonial governor. And as you can see there, that's the central court of the university, of Macquarie University. And the central court's a feature of every Enlightenment higher education institution. It's based on Camillo's 16th century Theatrum Mundi, but this is one with a distinctive Australian flavour because of the lemon-scented gum trees that were planted in the middle of the court there in a grid-like pattern. And here's now a picture of the same place, but in the 1980s, as depicted by one of the best known, but least institutionally collected Australian artists, and that's Proheart. Done in about the 1980s. It's a picture of that is also in the university's art collection. And this picture used to hang in the cashier's office, which used to be in one of the buildings surrounding the court that's depicted in that image as well. And that was back in the days when we didn't have sort of internet banking and you had to actually go somewhere to make a payment. And this painting sat there. That's no longer, we no longer have a cashier's office there. It's now a very, very nice noodle shop and takeaway, which I could quite strongly recommend. Okay, I also suspect I'm possibly depicted in that image as well, but I won't say where because it's somewhat embarrassing. Okay, so eventually the trees in the central court there grew up and they got turned into what museologists would call a dangerous or an unruly object. And dangerous and unruly objects are where part of the object itself breaks off from the surface and extends out randomly into the chaotic metaphysical context around it. So, of course, these dangerous objects had to be neutralized. And you can see them, there they are, having been neutralized, large grey behemoths lying on their side, completely reconciled now with their appointment with oblivion in clearing out the Great Court. There was some talk at one stage that the wood from these trees would be recycled into furniture. There is furniture now in the central court, but whether it's from these trees or not, nobody seems to quite know. Property and facilities are being quite coy on the subject when you approach them for answers. But if it was turned into furniture, then you could say it was a form of recycled heritage, if you like. Then there's also the buildings, the distinctive architecture. The architecture was a form of brutalist architecture by Wally Abraham, an interesting form of brutalism that's sometimes described as metabolic or organic, based on the matrix. And what that means is that if you have a look at all the original buildings that were on the campus, each side, there was at least one side on each building that is what architects would call open-faced. And this meant that you could add other buildings to it. And in fact, if you read about Wally Abraham's ideas behind his architectures, he saw that the architecture as being sort of processional across the campus through time. So there's a sense of a four-dimensional sort of fourth-dimensional nature to change on the site there. But of course, Wally's procession across the campus didn't really actually get started. And so some of those original buildings have been, I think the official management term is they've been deselected for preservation. So what's happened is they've been deselected completely for preservation. They no longer exist. They don't have any heritage value, etc., etc. And so what we have today is, of course, this beautiful kind of mixture of modernist architecture in amongst these sort of brutalist original buildings that were still there. Okay, now also other aspects of the campus that I'll just sort of touch on quite briefly, if I could. There's a picture of three public artworks from on campus, and one of them has been redone, one of them has been removed completely, and one has been rehoused. Now, your job is to write your answers as to which one has suffered which one of those fates. Rhonda and Gina, you're not allowed to go into this competition, and write your name and address on an envelope, post the address down the bottom there, Art Gallery, 19 Eastern Road, Macquarie University, New South Wales, 21009. And you, ladies and gentlemen, could be in the running to win this fabulous book, all about 50 of the greatest highlights of the Macquarie University art collection, with fantastic essays in there from Rhonda, myself, and Gina. Okay. Plenty of other changes over time too. We used to have a kind of a wayfinding system on campus that was based on a grid. That's all been replaced now by streets and street numbers. So we've kind of changed from a New York to a Venice wayfinding scheme. But if you look closely at some of the buildings, you can see the remnants of the old sort of code of letter, number, letter, kind of triple code that was applied to all the buildings on campus. And these are kind of, if you like, ghosts of objects past. I guess the point of, thank you. I guess the point of this is to say that we could use digital technologies to simulate the changes at the university through time, like Paula Dawson's holographic work, but what heritage value would it have? That's essentially the question. Okay, now when we've come to the point where with the digital, we now have the ability to endlessly replicate everything, but the ability has been with us for some time. The visual arts and photography and museum objects, for the visual arts has been photography, and for museum objects has been plaster casts. But the digital has raised this capability to the point of ubiquity and vastly compressed the timescales involved. So in heritage theory and museology, the tangible and intangible and the e-tangible were all designated as different parts, different types of information in a well-known paper by Ross Perry in 2007. Is it possible that this was simply an artifice to kind of protect that concept of the object? Would we in fact be better off, as some theorists have argued, to abandon the concept of the object and instead think in terms of relationships and interdependencies, strings and interactions, ecologies of existence that have been precipitated by the digital extension of what was initially the material turn? And there are certainly plenty of theorists who would argue just this. Now, it's an interesting question too, because if we look at the work of theorists in museology and heritage, these ideas and possibilities have always been there well before the digital turn. The education philosopher John Dewey spoke of engagement with an object as being transactional way back in the 1920s. European design theorists between the wars proposed that objects should be defined in terms of their relationships with each other. Andre Malraux's 1940s and 1950s concept of the museum without walls was certainly a precognition of cloud storage of data. Material culture theorists speak of the agency of objects, which also infers that they have their own ontological independence from ourselves. And of course, most recently and finally, the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, who argues that when we actually observe something, we see it, but we're also seeing something of ourselves at the same time. Thank you.